Thank you so much, Dominic, and thank you everyone who is here to really join us in our talk today. So, as we've all heard, my name is Elizabeth Onyango, and I'm here to speak to some of the work that have been or we've been doing over the past few years since coming to U of A. And my talk today is entitled Criminalization of Food Across Borders, Geographies of Importation and Food Security Among Ethnocultural Communities. And just to start us off, I want to begin by a land acknowledgement. So just from my end, I'm coming in as a newcomer, an immigrant of Kenyan descent. Have been in Canada for over the past 10 years, and currently I live in Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant communities. And based on the kind of work that I do, I think really acknowledging and situating myself in the space where I am, given that we engage with the land, we do community gardening, and the goal is really to grow some tropical vegetables and work alongside immigrant communities to provide or even ensure that they can have access to culturally relevant or culturally familiar vegetables. So, given that kind of work, really acknowledging and situating myself in the space where I am and acknowledging that some of these things can be quite uh, like bringing back those memories of colonization and those kinds of stuff. So, that's why I like to really start with a land acknowledgement. So, in terms of my presentation today, I want to create a context by just speaking to migration and mobility and how this has really or continues to shift the diversity within the cities and within rural communities in terms of the populations that we're seeing and how those particular changes are really contributing to the diverse needs that we also are seeing within the Canadian context or other places where people are moving into. I'll then speak to food security trends in migrant communities in the Canadian context. I'll speak to engagement in food security initiatives, particularly for the immigrant community, and give some evidence from some of the work that we've done within Alberta, that Edmonton, Calgary, is the two metropolitan cities in the province. And then just give a thought about looking into the future. What does that really mean? And what are some of the areas that we need to really put into consideration, especially when we are speaking about nutrition and potential health outcomes that relate to the kinds of foods that we eat, the kinds of foods we have access to. So I think this is almost familiar to most of us that today more people than ever live in a country other than the one in which they were born. And we can see from this particular graph that over the years, the trend or the number of people who are migrating or who are identifying as international migrants are increasing, not just in Canada, but across the globe. So in 2024, population division for UNDES identified that there were 304 million international migrants across the world. And this is this has nearly doubled from the number that we had in 1990, really showing that this particular trend in terms of international migration, in terms of people who are moving away from their countries to other places, has increased over the years and continue to increase. And I think with what we are seeing globally and the kind of wars that we are seeing, more and more people are leaving their countries because of such kind of instabilities. So while most people tend to migrate out of choice, others migrate out of necessity, either because of climate displacement or human rights violation issues, or because of war, economic instabilities, and many other issues that we are seeing across the world. In 2024 alone, the world hosted over 35 million refugees, including asylum seekers, some of whom are also have now moved within the Canadian context. We have them within our communities. And as this is happening, I think my main point here is really to emphasize the fact that as we continue to welcome new immigrants, it's important to also acknowledge the fact that these groups have unique needs, and particularly when it comes to issues of food. And just taking this more globally as well, looking at the places where people tend to migrate to. I think Europe, over the years, we've continued to see that a lot of people are tending to resettle or settle within the European context. But North America is also another critical destination place, as well as North Africa and Western Asia, which includes countries like the Middle Eastern countries that we know. So a lot of people are moving into these regions. This might be a little small, but when we look at international migrant population in terms of the shares, we are seeing that North America has a major chunk. We have 15.9% in North America, where most of these particular individuals or people who identify as international migrants are finding themselves in. And Europe has 12.6%. And I think the other place that is of interest is North Africa and the Middle East. And we know very well what's happening currently in that part of the world and what that really means in terms of the instability that occurring. And we are seeing that as of 2024, 9.3% of international migrants tended to settle in that particular region. So with all the issues that we're seeing, it basically means that more and more people are going to move even out of those particular places, and they have to find a new place, a new country for them, or a new region for them to really resettle and find a meaning and really that sense of belonging. And just moving into the Sustainable Development Goals, I think these are some of the goals, or even are the key goals that are really guiding most of our development agenda. And the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals really recognizes that immigrants and particularly international migrants really play a key role in terms of contributing to development, contributing to population maintenance. And I think Canada, we see that immigrants are the ones are really contributing to even the people who are working, the people who are even regulating the number of people that we have within the country. So the goal with these particular sustainable goals is not to leave anyone behind. We want to really bring everyone along so that by 2030, the immigrant communities are not left behind because we never thought about their unique needs and the kind of things that would allow them to resettle or even find a sense of belonging in place. So several targets from the SDGs really speak to the fact that there's need for us to put emphasis on some of these particular issues. So a good example, SDG Target 10.7 speaks to or even calls on countries to facilitate orderly, safe, and regular responsible migration, as well as mobility of people, including through implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. And I think there are many others. The one that I really wanted to speak to, even though this have something that's blocking my view there. So the one that I wanted to speak to is really calls SDG Target 17.8, which calls for disaggregating data by migratory status. I think we need to be able to really know who is most affected, and by really gathering evidence in these formats where the data is disaggregated by immigration status, by gender, and many other variables or many other factors that are relevant in terms of addressing equity, and particularly with a focus on health equity. I think there's that particular emphasis that is being put based on these sustainable development goals. In the Canadian context, let me just, okay. In the Canadian context, you're also seeing the same kind of trend happening. And this is where if we look at in 1870s or 1871, just following along, you're seeing that the population of international migrants in the Canadian context have consistently grown over the years, and it's projected that by 2050, we might get to a point where over 35% of Canada's population would be made up of individuals who consider themselves to be international migrants. And with that, I want us to just go to this particular link here. In terms of just looking at this particular interactive link, we are seeing that based on our place of birth and our place of residence, as of now, most of the newcomers that we see in Canada are coming from the Asian continent. And we have people from Europe, the Americas, Africa, and most of them are settling in Ontario. And then we're also seeing a number in BC, Quebec, Alberta, and then the other provinces as well. But I want us to go back to 1980. If we go back to 1980, the proportion of international or the proportion of people that were admitted in Canada between or before 1980, most of them came from Europe, then with a number from the Americas, and then the Asian continent, with a few from the African continent, and then the Oceanian or Oceania as like the other continent as well there. But if you look at 1991 and 2000, between 1991 and 2000, I think the demographics really shifted a lot. So we are seeing more and more people are coming from the Asian continent. We have Europe, the Americas, and the proportion of African immigrants is also growing or increasing with that. And most of them are still settling in Ontario, in BC, Quebec, Alberta. I mean, let's look at 2011, 2015. We can see the growth in terms of the African immigrants that are coming within the Canadian context, the Americas, but Asia still really maintains a larger chunk. And the same applies to 2016 to 2021. We are seeing that there's that particular growth and there's that particular shift in terms of the diversity, the kinds of people that we are seeing moving into the Canadian context. So just having that at the back of our mind and thinking about some of the unique needs that these groups or the diversity that we are seeing in the population comes along with is quite important, because that informs the kind of policies that we put in place and the kind of measures that would end up having to really ensure integration and resettlement. So I'll just go back to my slides and move ahead here. So with that in mind, what we are seeing is that migration is contributing to changes in socio-cultural as well as economic landscapes of cities. And more diverse groups are coming into our cities, into our communities, into our neighborhoods. And cities are witnessing the rise of a number of ethnic food stores, restaurants, as well as community gardening spaces. And people are really working towards really integrating and finding a space, a place where they can call home. And one thing that I've seen again and again, not just within the Canadian context, but even if you look at Australia, you look at Europe, as well as in the US, we are seeing that there's increased use of community gardening, gardens as spaces for well-being, restoration, as well as for social connection and for addressing food insecurity challenges, and particularly as spaces where people can grow the kind of herbs, the kind of vegetables that are familiar to them. So community gardens are increasingly recognized as neighborhood assets, and they are being used as tools for transformation as well as for community development and creating spaces where people can really find that sense of belonging. And accommodating these kinds of activities often requires changes in zoning, regulations, as well as land use policies, which I think most of our cities are struggling with. And I know based on my experience working within Alberta, as well as in Ontario, where I was before coming to Alberta, it's quite hard to get to a point where a community has access to a gardening space within the city. And I know it can take up to 3 to 5 years to get some of these particular approvals and to allow people to really begin to engage with the land and engage in our local production and that kind of stuff. So it really communicates to us that there are certain barriers, there are certain limitations that exist within our communities. Okay. Just to continue with the presentation. So with all these kinds of changes that we are seeing, we also are witnessing the fact that most of these newcomers are experiencing food insecurity, which really remains a key public health concern that is worsening with the increasing cost of living. And we are still, I think, we still have the impact of the pandemic, but we're also seeing all these new changes in terms of geopolitics continuing to exacerbate the social and economic inequalities within the cities or within the communities that we are in. And in the Canadian context, most of the marginalized communities, particularly the immigrants and indigenous communities, really tend to be at an increased risk in terms of accessing culturally familiar foods. And some of these particular foods are quite nutritious and quite healthy for these particular communities. So the issues that have been identified really relate to socioeconomic and racial disparities in terms of accessing some of these foods. And this relates to issues like even employment, issues to do with um, not having access, not being imported from the countries where the foods are grown and are being brought here at an affordable price. So they continuously really struggle to find the kinds of foods that are familiar to them. In 2024, the Canadian Income Community Survey found that uh, food insecurity was quite a major health issue or even a major public health issue that affected at least or over 1 in 4 households. And in Alberta, I think the number is even much higher, where we had 30.9%. And just to reiterate the fact that it's the indigenous communities and the newcomers that tend to be most affected. The trend is really on the rise, and this was in 2023, but I think there is also data for 2024, which really shows that since the pandemic, we have had this consistent kind of an increase in terms of the number of households that are experiencing food insecurity. Income is not keeping pace with the food prices. And as a result, we are seeing that people are working hard, people are working 2, 3 jobs, and yet the income that they're making is not sufficient to really maintain or even keep their families going. And as a result, it's food that is often left behind. People would rather pay their rent, they would rather pay their mortgage and ensure that they have utilities taken care of, and food becomes one of that last resort kind of an issue. And those who are at risk are households with children, female-lone parents, immigrants, just as I've mentioned, single people who are working, which is quite surprising, people who are working, but they're still not able to meet their basic needs. The unhoused populations are quite at risk. And just to confirm the statistics in terms of the immigrant communities and the indigenous community in 2024 alone, the Black communities, within the Black communities in the Canadian context, 46.7% reported that they were experiencing some level of food insecurity. Amongst the Indigenous communities, 39.9%. Those are quite high numbers. What it means, basically, nearly half the households that identify as Black or African reported to be experiencing some level of food insecurity. And as more Black identifying individuals continue to migrate into the Canadian provinces, it's important for us to really emphasize the need to increase access to some of the kinds of foods that are relevant to them, because We keep on talking about food insecurity as an economic issue, but I think there's more to it beyond the economic challenge that needs to also be considered because you can have access to food, yes. We know very well you can have access to canned beans, you can have access to pasta and many other things. But if these are not foods that are familiar to you, you'd still remain culturally, or even you still remain food insecure, even though you have access to some of these items. And we know very well too that food is central to resettlement and integration. And it really acts as a means or a mode of adapting effectively. If I have access to what is culturally familiar to me, what is the kind of food that I know, I think it really allows me to feel that sense of belonging, identify with a place pretty quick. So people have developed some coping strategies as well as resistance to the prevailing systems that really speak otherwise about newcomers. And just to share some of these that I have seen within our communities, we're seeing people beginning to really engage with the land in different ways. People are coming together in potlucks and really sharing their diverse cultures through food. They're coming together in recreation places to really connect over food and share their identities, their cultures via or even through food sharing and those kinds of activities. We're also seeing that people are gardening and really enhancing their environment, so even supporting their economic well-being in different ways through production of some of these vegetables that they can freeze and then use them during the cold months when maybe you do not have enough, but if you can grow during the summer and then freeze, you can be able to really save some of the dollars. We're also seeing some social connections where people are coming together, they're sharing fresh produces as part of their connection to the land, connection to the community. There's also the use of the food bank, and we are seeing that this has also increased over time. More and more people are using the food bank as a coping strategy. And over the years, or even particularly after the pandemic, we've seen that more and more people are using the food bank, but we're also witnessing that eating of fruits and veggies is also on the decline. And what really this means is that more and more people are not getting those fresh produce or they're not eating the healthy foods, which means that their health and well-being is being affected either at the moment or within the next few years would begin to see some of these particular issues. And we also know very well that newcomers, when they come in, at the beginning, they're quite healthy, but within a short period of time, about 5 years, we begin to see some of these health challenges emerging from the communities. At the city level, we're also seeing that the major metropolitan cities, the city of Calgary and the city of Edmonton, have formulated some of these councils or even the food policy councils for them to really have conversations around food needs and what needs to be done within the city. The unfortunate bit is that the Edmonton Food Council got wrapped off or even closed down last year because of lack of buy-in from the city. But my hope is that it will come back again. But the one in Calgary is quite active. They really are working towards having these policy conversations around food security and engaging diverse communities when it comes to food access and creating spaces where people can engage in different ways. So before I go into that particular study that we did, have highlighted a number of initiatives, a number of activities within the city, within the communities where we are. But one thing that we've acknowledged over the years, it's that not everyone is engaged the same way. And that's what really informed the study that we engaged in, where we really wanted to know um, the experiences of newcomers with engagement in food security initiatives and whether there are certain barriers, whether there are certain issues that are emerging or are occurring within their contexts. So we identified that, or even based on what I've already mentioned, there's need for us to really make cities more innovative and dynamic in terms of really meeting some of these particular needs. And for us to be able to get to that point, meaningful engagement of vulnerable populations that are disproportionately impacted by food insecurity is very, very key. So these local initiatives must endeavor to be culturally relevant and really address the unique needs that the newcomers have. And that's where we were coming from with this particular study, where we engaged in a community-based kind of a study with the multicultural, no, with Synconia, which is a community-based organization supporting newcomers and their integration within Edmonton. I think partly we also engaged with the multicultural health brokers and really through their cultural brokers, particularly the South Sudanese community in that case. So we purposively sample from these community organizations to really have a conversation around engaging in our food security initiatives in different ways. So we did some sharing circles, so Afrocentric sharing circles with African newcomers in Calgary and then also in Edmonton. And we also did some in-depth interviews, 13 in Calgary, 9 in Edmonton. And these were done either in person or online using a semi-structured kind of an interview. And we analyzed these particular interviews thematically and really made sense of what the participants were talking about. We also went back to our participants and really spoke to them whether what is being reflected within our results truly reflect their experiences with engagement in food security initiatives. So in terms of our participants, we had more females than males. So about 80% were females, 20% are male. And the age range was between 31 to 56 years with an average of 43. And I know this might not be as relevant given that this is a qualitative kind of a study, but I think it's important for us to just know where this data is coming from. And most of these individuals migrated to either Edmonton or Calgary between 1992 to 2023. So some of the countries of origin, Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Ghana, Cameroon, Somalia, and Zimbabwe. And we identified that most of these particular participants, over 65%, had post-secondary education level. So there were people who were adequately trained or had some formal education. So from our analysis of the evidence that we collected, sociocultural dimensions of engagement was one underlying theme. And I'm going to be speaking to these, each of them. So then the other thing that emerged to shifting definition of what is food in time and place, and depending on where you are at. And then also representation of African food in everyday life. So just to go through each of these particular themes, with reference to sociocultural dimensions of engagement, participants' engagement in community-led and government initiatives for food insecurity, these are significantly influenced by language. So people felt that language was a key barrier. And a good example that we had from our participants, because we had questions around, are you part of the city or the municipal food council within your city? And people felt that their language or even the ability to really have deep conversations in those particular contexts were the spaces were not just meant for them, and language played a key role in terms of really making that decision whether to join or be part of those conversations. There's also that piece on social cohesion in either facilitating or hindering engagement. So people felt that some of these particular spaces are not just meant for them. And a good example is the community gardening spaces where people would prefer to really grow their own kinds of herbs that they would like to use for their cultural foods. But when you bring in a new seed into these particular spaces, you really have to answer certain questions, and people feel that some of the seeds might be invasive and nobody knows about those particular seeds. So there's that feeling that the spaces are not just meant or are not just suitable for some specific groups of people. For many African and Black immigrants, the definition of food shifts significantly upon arrival in Canada. And this is one element that people spoke about. So, one seen as a symbol of tradition, culture, celebration, and cultural identity, but now it is redefined and reduced to a source of sustenance and survival. It is no longer rooted in enjoyment, love, and dignity. Yet, based on one of our participants, or most of our participants, food is a key part of any cultural tradition that we are putting on or we are passing on. So, based on this, this was a participant in a focus group discussion in Calgary who really spoke to how food is part of who we are. And when you can't really have that enjoyment and connection and the feeling of being connected with your community via food, there's that missing piece that exists out there. So one of our participants also talked about when racialized persons walk through the door of a service provider. So this was with reference to accessing services within the community. It is really based on that interaction. It is heavily dependent on what the interaction with the first person, the provider, how that goes. And that really determines whether they would return back or really not feel like that space is meant for them. When it comes to shifting definition of food, which really ties closely to that previous theme as well, the definition of food is quite dependent on temporal and place-based characteristics. And with migration, the definition of what is food versus what is not food really changes rapidly. Something that you'd identify as food in your home country, when you move with it to the border, you get to that point where food is seen as something else. It's no longer food, it's something else. It's something that can either pass on certain microorganisms that might be invasive or something else. So coming from the other element that they also spoke to, other than that piece of shifting definition, in your home country, you have this, which is defined as food. But when you migrate, then there's that piece that comes in with changes in the definition of food. They also spoke to the issue or to the fact that coming from a collectivist kind of a culture where food is a shared resource and something that you do not need to ask for, the cultural definition of food changes with migration as well. And if you look at, one of our participants really spoke to the fact that some of these particular foods that come from certain regions are not just allowed to come in. But I think it's also based on numbers and the number of people that have been here much longer. So this spoke to this, and I mentioned that if you can look into the ban on some African items and food materials that are not allowed in the country, and then they mentioned that maybe that would be for another project, and see why and how we should lift the ban and let people enjoy what they love. So anyway, just speaking about that, the issues and the challenges of really having access to some of these particular foods. And then the third theme here really speaks to that lack of representation of African foods within the main grocery stores. So most of these particular foods are not found in these particular spaces, and they spoke to the othering of some of the foods that they would really want to have access to, but in actual sense, they are not made available. They also thought or even reflected on the idea that most of the ethnic food stores are located in certain places where the bus routes are not there. They are not accessible in most cases. And as a result, it really limits their ability to be able to access these particular foods. And just to conclude, what we are hearing in general from these particular themes that we see here in the conversations that we had with our participants is the fact that beyond food as an income kind of a challenge, as an economic kind of an issue, it's important for us to really think of food security, with reference to the way we connect over food, either food bringing in that feeling of love, comfort, family, and home. Food also playing a key role in terms of the culture or even people sharing their own cultures, their own identities, and customs, traditions, and relating this back to connection, sense of belonging, community that's built around food when people are able to share some of these things that they feel are part of their identities. And that's why traditional or cultural or familiar foods, when people have access to them, I think it really moves beyond just the economic piece to also ensure that people's physical health, because some of these particular foods are quite rich. A good example that our participants talked about is with a reference to a vegetable like even a jute mallow, which is eaten, I think, across Latin America, the African continent, as well as in East or South East Asia and the Asian continent as well. Jute mallow is quite rich in iron. But when people migrate, these kinds of vegetables are not accessible. And as a result, we are seeing that most of our women, immigrant women, tend to experience anemia as one of the physical health challenges. So it's important for us to really create a space where people can have access to their cultural foods so that we can protect their physical health. Traditional eating is nutrient, or even our traditional foods, they are nutrient dense and high in fiber, as well as they can provide additional kinds of micronutrients that are very important to the body. When people share these particular foods, it creates a support for immigrants to really find themselves, or even to find a sense of belonging and support their mental health when they have what they refer to as a taste of home. It strengthens familial as well as community health, so passing on cultural food values and traditions to younger generations, which can be done within community gardening spaces, as well as when we have these ceremonies or events where people connect over food. It nurtures social relationships, so food as a means of belonging, as a play, as a means of belonging, and a tool for creating, or even for placemaking and creating that sense of a place as people migrate and get into our communities. So with that, I think these kinds of benefits that come along with accessing cultural foods are really beneficial in terms of people's health and overall well-being. And as Canada continues to welcome newcomers, it's important to really acknowledge some of these unique needs in our populations. Thank you so much for listening, and any questions?